Whose Business Is to Die is the 6th in the series about the 106, and for the moment it's the last one, the latest one I've done. As I've explained before, I would very much like to continue this series. I really want to take the 106th all the way through Spain, into Central Europe, to Canada, and eventually to Mont Saint Jean and the fields of Waterloo, and before that Quatre Bras. And I've got to the point where I'm almost, in my mind, forming a second battalion for the regiment to make it easier within the story for our heroes to get posted around and end up in these different places. But all of that depends on, at some point, having the time to do it, and more importantly, persuading a publisher to let me write the book. So one day I hope the story won't end forever here, but I can't promise when there'll be a next installment. So we'll have to leave it at the end of this story where, well, I won't give too much away, but we don't quite know what's going to happen to Hanley. So, Whose Business Is to Die, and once again the title comes from one of the songs of the period that they're so very evocative. Like a lot of folk music, it romanticizes different aspects of life in the past, but it gives you a different insight, a different perspective. And it culminates in the Battle of Albuera, which was why the title seemed so appropriate, because the losses of the Allies in general and the British in particular at that battle were very, very high, particularly proportionally high in some of the units involved. But before that, we have actions elsewhere, and we have the character of Colborne, who's probably known best for commanding the 52nd Foot at Waterloo and taking part in the repulse of the Imperial Guard attacks late in the day, but also doing quite a lot of other things. So Colborne is relatively well known, and it's interesting to see him and to have William spending some time with him during the early part of the campaign, where Colborne did a lot of marching, demonstrating and showing off. That's recorded in some detail. And again, it's one of those lesser known aspects of the war. There is a tendency, for all accounts of the Peninsular War, to focus on the big battles. And obviously, most of my stories, there's a pretty big battle at some point in it, though others rely more on skirmishes. But those are a few days in the course of years of campaigning. So a lot of the book is about the in-between, the campaigning. We've got Hanley developing as much more of an intelligence exploring officer. Jenny Dobson reappears, and she's always been a fun character to write as well, so that's quite good. And she and Hanley start to develop further a relationship that's begun when she reappeared in all in scarlet uniform, but now we see her again that much more confident, accomplished, sophisticated, and Hanley's trying to work out how he can use her for the cause, and she's trying to work out what's in it for me. So that's rather fun. Jane McAndrews is there, and again, just as in Beat the Drum Slowly, the two women were quite fun to write as sparring off each other. There are bits where I get to do that again in Whose Business Is to Die. So Williams does things, Pringle does things, McAndrews is back, and we also see, for the first time, a siege from the perspective of the attacker. Now, we've had in all of Scarlet Uniform the siege of Ciudad Rodrigo. We see one of the early sieges of Badajoz. Remember, it's the third siege where the British actually stormed the city in 1812 at such appalling cost. They try to attack it before with much lesser resources than they'll have when they finally succeed. But it gives a sense of how you go about this, what's involved. And that was quite interesting to see how our characters would cope. Truscott's back again, one of the friends from early on who's lost his arm in Portugal in 1808, now recovered. He's got a younger brother who's he's trying to protect within the battalion. So we get to see things from several perspectives, from the young officers as well as the more experienced old sweats by this time. We get to see a bit about siege warfare, but then the book has two battles in it. We see a little bit of Fuente de Honoro, where Hanley is present, and that's another of those battles that can tend to fall into the simple Wellington's attacked in a position and defends it and wins. And obviously people think of the bitter fighting within the village itself and its very narrow streets, but also famously on the second day of fighting, when the Wellington's right flank was overwhelmed by a French advance, and the Light Division under the recently returned Black Bob Crawford marches out and covers the retreat of these other things, then retreats in the face of large numbers of French cavalry over a plain for a considerable distance, forming square, holding them off, forming back into column, marching, forming square when threatened, moving, all of that. So that's one of those great moments of the Peninsular War from a British perspective that you feel you have to include. So it was fun to write that. And again, when you look closely at most of these battles, the way the story is told tends to oversimplify things. And that's partly because so many of the classic accounts of the Peninsular War that set the tone for a very long time, whether it's Longford's biography of Wellington, whether it's Jack Weller's Wellington the Peninsula, Glover's book from the same period, they're covering all of the war, and they tend to go highlights battle to battle to battle. And yes, they do, when you look closely, they do their very best to explain what's going on in between. But there's almost this sense of an inevitability about it all. The British are going to win, Wellington's going to do defensive victory, and then he can start to attack people at Salamanca, Vittoria, and he'll show what he can do then. But you're all building towards that, and there's a sense of it's just natural that Wellington and his army are going to win. Whereas you read Wellington's dispatches at the time, you read accounts at the time, all of these things are, as Wellington was so fond of saying, damn near run things. These are dangerous. The French army in the Peninsular War, as more generally, is very good, and it's very dangerous. So this is one of those battles where it could all have gone horribly wrong, because Wellington has split his army. You've got the southern force by Badajoz under Beresford that will lead to our main sort of set piece in the story, that is the Battle of Albuera. And there again, Marshal Soult, leading a French army that's slightly smaller than the Anglo-Portuguese-Spanish army under Beresford, outflanks the Allies, completely outwits them, comes from an unexpected direction, starts to launch an attack, and fortunately for the Allies, Zayas' division of the Spanish army and some other troops hold him off for long enough for Beresford to switch enough of the army to reinforce that flank. Otherwise, the whole army would probably have been rolled up and broken up and collapsed very quickly. So again, it's another epic. It's one of the great days of the Spanish regular infantry in the Peninsular War, and it's nice to have it in the story where, again, they're facing off against much larger numbers, but they stand there and they take it. And I've even included in the story that comes from a personal account, a British officer being passed by a Spanish officer who insists it's important for him to know that they've been ordered to retreat. They're not running. They're doing this because even though they've run out of ammunition, they've been told to go back. Albuera was a nasty, confused fighting that on the Allied side does not have great displays of generalship. Beresford doesn't cope very well, perhaps because he doesn't have much experience of leading a force this size, and also you are dealing with three different nationalities. It isn't always easy to combine them together and move seamlessly. So a lot happens that is bad, is confusing. You have, again, Colborne's brigade. It's one of the other incidents for which Colborne's famous. They see an opportunity. They march alongside the French, hoping to form into line and then take the main French attack in the flank. They are then in turn attacked in the flank by the Lancers of the Vistula, more Polish troops, just like in Run Them Ashore, and the second French Hussars, who almost annihilate, as a fighting unit for the day, take Colborne's brigade out of the equation. 3 battalions are pretty much ridden down. One of the remaining one of the 4 manages to form a rally square and hold off. A battery of King's German Legion artillery is overrun. So a large part, the British are coming up to try and help the Spanish, and one of the brigades is taken out. Then you have Horton's brigade and others who then fight a slogging match against the French. This is a long-term exchange of musketry where losses are appallingly heavy on both sides because neither side is willing to quit. And again, it's not the simple French column attacks British line wins. It's much more complicated, it's much closer fought. And then, of course, Albuera is a battle for great epics, and it inspired Napier, of course, though in part that also led to a very acrimonious exchange between Napier and his supporters and Beresford and his supporters as to what happened, which is one of the reasons why it's one of the best documented battles of British involvement in the peninsula. So we get all the fighting there, we get the advance of, I've put the main 106th under MacAndrews there in the Fusilier Brigade. and they take part in that, the part of the 4th Division that was there, this big attack of a British brigade and some Portuguese who advance against lots of French cavalry, then infantry, and drive them back. But again, it's another slaughterhouse. The losses are appalling on both sides. Soult perhaps was one of those French commanders who was better at strategy and getting to a battle than he was at actually fighting the battle himself. His real talent seemed to have lain in the preparation, the build-up, the cleverness then, and he doesn't quite handle it well. But also, Sour Grapes to some extent said that, well, the Allies were beaten, they just didn't know it, and they wouldn't accept it, so they kept fighting, and in the end, Soult does have a smaller army. So he attacks, he does a lot of damage, but the Allies managed to hold him off, which means that tactically and strategically they've achieved their objective, though they're not really in much fit state to press the siege of Badajoz for a while. So Albuera was one of those battles that's always rather fascinated me, and there's been some marvellous studies of it over the last decade or so that were great material for the novels. And again, it's interesting because it's a big battle of the Peninsular War and Wellington isn't there. And it's not fought, you feel, had Wellington been there, things would have been rather different. The Allies would not have behaved in quite such a clumsy way. But there again, you can't expect Beresford suddenly to be able to command an army, never having done it on this scale before. And there are stories as well that beg to be told, but also you can look at it and think, well, actually, that's probably not as simple as it's presented. So one of them famously is of the French lance or the Polish lancers riding amongst Beresford and his staff, and Beresford, who, whatever else you say about him, was a very big, powerful man, knocks one out of the saddle. So that's in there. But also you have another occasion where a brigade of Spanish infantry, or most of it a small division, refuses to advance when Beresford rides up and drags one of their colonels towards the enemy. And you do have to wonder, this is told by the British point of view, oh, well, that just means, these Spanish troops were not well motivated, their officers weren't any good, they wouldn't lead them properly, and they were too cautious to attack in a desperate situation. It might also be that some foreigner you don't very well has ridden up, is shouting semi-coherently, because Beresford is clearly pretty worked up at this point, and starts to manhandle one of your colonels. This might be a misunderstanding, and a natural resentment is that, well, we obey proper orders. We've been told to stay here. Some strange guy's turned up and is telling us to do other things. What are we supposed to do about this? That's not what soldiers do, is just obey any bloke who comes up and shouts at you. So again, you can tell all of these things in more than one way, and I've tried to explore that a little bit in the novel and be fair to everyone and show the courage on all sides, because all the different nationalities that took part, this is a slogging match and a very brutal one, and yet the armies keep going and eventually the French pull back and the Allies are left standing. But again, it's very, very close. So Albuera was a battle I'd wanted to write really since I started the series. Partly there's also a slightly sort of selfish delight in the fact that it's one that Bernard Cornwell hasn't covered yet. I mean, I'm sure if ever he gets the time, he'll probably do a magnificent Sharp one where Richard Sharp will end up there and it'll be a really good book. But it was nice to write, as with some of the others, a battle that hasn't been written about in modern novels. So you feel you can come at it fresh. You're not trying for the sake of it to be different to somebody else, but you also don't feel you're being trammeled in a way of telling it. Because that's already been set. That's the story of the battle, therefore you can't, it's quite hard, even if it's unconscious, to break out from that. So that's Whose Business Is to Die. We've got some good moments, I hope, some good emotional stuff. Again, there's Williams and Jane are making things difficult for themselves. There's Hanley and Jenny enjoying sparring, each one trying to use and manipulate the other. They're quite fun. Billy Pringle just getting on with things and growing as well. MacAndrews, the gloomy Highlander, who's always enjoys it when things are difficult, but seems to find a way through. So there's lots to happen, there's lots for characters, there's loads of history. That's the thing I enjoyed so much about writing these stories, is that it's such a wonderful, remarkable, real story that you're putting characters that certainly I like very much, I've grown very fond of, that are interesting, that are exciting, people with whom you want to spend time, and they're fun to be with in the story, and they're going through this. So you're learning about the background, or maybe if you're already familiar, hopefully you're getting a slightly different perspective on it, but it's more about our characters, our central group, As I said at the very start introducing the series, the idea was not a single hero who'd be everywhere and do everything, but a group of people who between them have quite a lot of heroic qualities, but also some less impressive ones as well. So hopefully it's fun, and hopefully there's the humour, the dark humour that's been there all the way through is still there. So for the moment, Whose Business Is to Die and Albuera is as far as we've got, so we're only in June 1811. But as I say, one day, my hope still is to finish off the saga, to do more of these stories, but I have to wait until someone offers me the chance to do that.